We can still be friends, my ex Marcus said with that charming smile that once made my heart skip. So I smiled back and said, of course. What he didn't know was that I'd already become best friends with his boss's wife, Elena. And when she discovered what Marcus had been doing behind everyone's back, including her husband's company funds, his world crumbled faster than a house of cards. The look on his face when Elena stood up at the company gala and announced the audit results? Priceless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I never thought I'd be the type of woman to plot revenge. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, I was always the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over conflicts and made everyone feel comfortable. My name is Sofia Chen, and at 31, I thought I had life figured out. I worked as a marketing coordinator at Riverside Creative Agency, lived in a cozy apartment in the Pearl District, and had been in what I believed was a loving relationship with Marcus Rivera for 3 years. Marcus was everything I thought I wanted in a partner. Tall, dark-haired, with green eyes that seemed to sparkle when he talked about his dreams. He worked as a senior account manager at Morrison Associates, one of Portland's most prestigious consulting firms. We met at a networking event downtown, and he swept me off my feet with his confidence and ambition. He talked about traveling the world together, buying a house with a view of Mount Hood, maybe even starting a family someday. For 3 years, I molded myself around his schedule, his preferences, his vision of our future. When he said he preferred my hair longer, I stopped getting it cut. When he mentioned that his colleagues, girlfriends, were more stylish, I spent money I didn't have updating my wardrobe. When he complained that my job wasn't prestigious enough, I started looking for positions at bigger agencies, even though I loved where I worked. The unraveling began on a rainy Thursday evening in October. I had planned a special dinner to celebrate our 3-year anniversary. I'd spent hours preparing his favorite meal, bought a bottle of wine we'd shared on our first date, and even splurged on new lingerie that made me feel confident and beautiful. The apartment was filled with the warm glow of candles, and soft jazz played in the background. Marcus arrived 2 hours late without an explanation or apology. He barely glanced at the effort I'd put in, instead heading straight to the refrigerator for a beer. I watched him pop it open and take a long drink before finally acknowledging me. "Sofia, we need to talk," he said, settling onto the couch without even taking off his jacket. The words every woman dreads hearing hung in the air like smoke from the extinguished birthday candles of childhood wishes. I turned off the music and sat across from him, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. 3 years of shared memories, inside jokes, and whispered promises seemed to crystallize in that moment, waiting to either be preserved or shattered. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Marcus continued, his voice taking on that practiced tone he used with difficult clients. "About us, about where we're going, about what I want out of life." He paused, as if waiting for me to say something, but my throat felt like sandpaper. "The thing is, Sofia, I think we've grown in different directions. I'm at a pivotal point in my career. Morrison Associates is expanding internationally, and there are opportunities coming up that could change everything for me. I need to be able to focus completely on my professional growth right now. I found my voice, though it came out smaller than I'd intended. I've always supported your career, Marcus. I've never asked you to choose between me and your work." He had the grace to look uncomfortable for a moment. "I know you have, and I appreciate that. But I think I need to be single right now, to really concentrate on becoming the man I'm meant to be." The words hit me like ice water. 3 years of my life, of planning and dreaming and building something together, reduced to an obstacle in his path to greatness. I thought about all the times I'd rearranged my schedule for his work events, all the weekends I'd spent alone while he networked or traveled, all the dreams I'd put on hold to support his ambitions. "Is there someone else?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer from the way he couldn't quite meet my eyes. Marcus ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing but now seemed calculating. "It's not like that, Sofia. It's not about another person. It's about me needing space to grow." But I could see the lie in the way his jaw tightened, in the defensive set of his shoulders. There was someone else. I just didn't know who yet. "Look," he said, reaching over to touch my hand with what I suppose he thought was kindness. I don't want to lose you completely. You're an amazing person, and I care about you deeply. Can't we still be friends? I think that would be better for both of us, don't you? Friends. After 3 years of sharing a bed, sharing dreams, sharing a life, he wanted to be friends. It was such a casual dismissal of everything we'd built together, like he was returning a shirt that didn't quite fit anymore but was still nice enough to keep in the closet for special occasions. I looked at Marcus sitting there in my carefully prepared dinner setting, surrounded by the evidence of my love and effort, asking me to accept the scraps of friendship after he'd decided I wasn't worthy of his romantic attention anymore. Something shifted inside me in that moment. Not heartbreak, though that would come later. Not anger, though that was building. What I felt was a kind of crystalline clarity, like suddenly seeing a magic eye puzzle after staring at meaningless dots for hours. Of course, I heard myself saying, my voice steady and calm. I'd like that too. Marcus looked relieved, probably expecting tears and drama and the kind of messy emotional scene he'd prepared himself to weather. Instead, I stood up and began clearing the untouched dinner from the table, moving with the efficient grace of someone who had just made a decision. I'm so glad you understand, he said, finishing his beer and checking his phone. I was worried this might be difficult. Not at all, I replied, scraping the carefully prepared meal into the garbage disposal. Friends it is. He left 20 minutes later, taking his spare key, and the last 3 years of my life with him. I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of a celebration that never happened, and felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Freedom. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of purpose. For the first time in years, I didn't immediately check my phone to see if Marcus had texted. I didn't plan my day around his schedule or consider how my choices might affect his mood. Instead, I made myself a proper breakfast and sat by my window, watching the city wake up below me. I'd always been good at reading people, at understanding social dynamics and building connections. It was what made me effective in marketing, what helped me navigate complex client relationships and office politics. But I'd spent so long focused on Marcus and his needs that I'd forgotten to apply those skills to my own life. Now, sitting in the autumn sunlight with my coffee growing cold, I began to think strategically about my situation. Marcus wanted to be friends. He'd made that very clear. And friends, as everyone knows, share information about their lives. They introduce each other to other friends. They become part of each other's broader social circles. Marcus had always been protective of his work life, keeping it separate from our relationship in a way that I'd found frustrating but had learned to accept. He rarely talked about his colleagues beyond the basic information, never invited me to company events, and seemed to have a completely different personality when he was in professional mode. At the time, I'd attributed it to his ambitious nature and desire to maintain boundaries. Now I wondered what else he'd been keeping separate. I knew he worked for Morrison and
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Associates, a mid-sized consulting firm with offices in Portland, Seattle, and San Francisco. I knew his boss was someone named Richard Morrison, the son of the company's founder, and that Marcus was always trying to impress him. I knew there was talk of international expansion, and that Marcus was positioning himself to be part of it. But beyond these basic facts, his work life remained largely mysterious to me. If we were going to be friends, I decided, perhaps it was time I took a genuine interest in his professional world. After all, that's what friends do. They support each other's careers, attend each other's work functions, and get to know each other's colleagues. I began to smile as the plan took shape in my mind. The opportunity came sooner than I'd expected. The next Friday, I was at my favorite yoga studio in the Alberta district when I overheard a conversation between 2 women changing in the locker room. One of them was complaining about her husband's upcoming work gala and how boring these corporate events always were. "Richard's so stressed about this year's Morrison Associates annual gala," she was saying to her friend. "They're trying to impress some potential international partners, and he's been working 16-hour days making sure everything's perfect." My ears perked up at the mention of Morrison Associates. I glanced over discreetly and saw an elegant woman in her early 40s with auburn hair and kind eyes. She was tall and graceful, the kind of person who looked naturally sophisticated without trying too hard. "Elena, you should just tell him you're not going," her friend replied. "You hate those things anyway." Elena. This was Richard Morrison's wife, the boss's wife that Marcus had mentioned occasionally but never really talked about in detail. She was complaining about the very gala that Marcus had been excited about for weeks. The event he'd mentioned was crucial for his career advancement. I made a split-second decision that would change everything. "Excuse me?" I said, approaching them with my most friendly smile. "I couldn't help but overhear you mention Morrison Associates. I think my friend works there. Maybe we know some of the same people?" Elena looked up with interest. "Oh, really? What's your friend's name?" "Marcus Rivera. He's a senior account manager there." "Marcus!" Elena's face lit up with recognition. "Yes, Richard mentions him quite often. He's very impressed with Marcus's work. You're lucky to have such an ambitious friend." Friend. The word still stung a little, but I pushed the feeling aside. "Yes, he's wonderful. I'm Sofia, by the way." "Elena Morrison." "It's so nice to meet you, Sofia." She extended her hand with genuine warmth. "And this is my friend Karen." We chatted for a few more minutes about the neighborhood, the yoga studio, and general pleasantries. Elena was exactly the kind of person I'd always enjoyed being around. Intelligent, curious about others, and possessed of that rare quality of making everyone feel heard and valued. As we talked, I learned that she was a freelance graphic designer who worked primarily with nonprofit organizations, that she'd moved to Portland from San Francisco 5 years ago when Richard took over the family business, and that she was always looking for new friends in the city. "You know," Elena said as we prepared to leave, "if you're interested, you should come to the Morrison Associates Gala next weekend." I know Richard would love to meet Marcus's friends, and honestly, I could use someone to talk to who isn't discussing quarterly projections and market penetration strategies all night. My heart raced. This was better than anything I could have planned. "That sounds wonderful, but are you sure it would be okay?" I wouldn't want to impose. "Not at all. These events are always more fun with friends. Richard won't mind at all. And I'm sure Marcus would be happy to see you there." I almost laughed at that last part, imagining Marcus's face when I showed up at his precious work gala as a guest of his boss's wife. "I'd love to come." We exchanged numbers, and Elena promised to text me the details about the dress code and timing. As I walked home from yoga, I felt a spring in my step that had been missing for months. For the first time since Marcus had broken up with me, I felt like I was moving forward rather than just surviving. The week leading up to the gala passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Elena and I texted regularly, and I found myself genuinely enjoying our conversations. She was witty and insightful, with a sharp sense of humor that emerged once she felt comfortable with someone. We discovered shared interests in art, hiking, and terrible reality TV shows that we both watched as guilty pleasures. "I'm so excited to have someone to talk to at this thing," Elena texted me the day before the gala. "Last year I spent the entire evening listening to Richard's golf buddies explain why craft beer was ruining America. I nearly died of boredom. I spent considerable time choosing my outfit for the gala. It needed to be elegant enough for a high-end corporate event, but I also wanted to feel confident and beautiful. I settled on a deep emerald green dress that brought out my dark eyes and made my black hair look glossy under lights. It was more expensive than anything I'd bought myself in years, but it felt like an investment in my new life." The Morrison & Associates annual gala was held at the historic Sentinel Hotel in downtown Portland. As I walked into the elegant ballroom with Elena, I felt a mixture of nerves and excitement that reminded me of opening night of a school play. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables dressed in cream and gold, and soft jazz music played while guests mingled with drinks. Elena immediately began introducing me to people as her friend Sofia, and I was struck by how naturally she included me in conversations. She had that rare gift of making everyone feel welcome and important, whether she was talking to a senior partner or someone's spouse who clearly felt out of place. I spotted Marcus across the room about 20 minutes after we arrived. He was deep in conversation with a group of men in expensive suits, his posture straight and his expression focused. He looked good, I had to admit. Success suited him, and he wore his charcoal gray suit-like armor that announced his ambitions to anyone paying attention. Elena followed my gaze and waved at him. "Marcus, come meet my new friend." I watched his face as he approached us, seeing the exact moment when recognition dawned. His confident smile faltered slightly, and I caught a flicker of something that might have been panic in his green eyes. But Marcus had always been good at recovering quickly, and by the time he reached us, his professional mask was firmly in place. "Sofia," he said, leaning in to give me a brief hug that felt stiff and performative. "What a surprise to see you here." "Elena was kind enough to invite me," I replied with a bright smile. "She mentioned that you two work together, and I thought it would be fun to see your professional side." "How wonderful that you two know each other," Elena said, clearly pleased with the connection. "Sofia and I met at yoga, and we've become fast friends. She's absolutely delightful." Marcus's smile looked like it was carved from wood. "Yes, Sofia is full of surprises." Over the next hour, I watched Marcus navigate the party with the skill of someone who'd spent years perfecting his professional persona. He was charming with clients, deferential to senior partners, and smoothly confident with peers. But I also noticed things I'd never seen before, or perhaps had chosen not to see. He name-dropped constantly, weaving references to expensive restaurants and exclusive events into every conversation. He laughed too loudly at Richard Morrison's jokes and agreed too quickly with everything the senior partners said. There was a desperation underneath his polish that made me feel embarrassed for him. "Marcus is quite the networker," Elena observed quietly as we watched him work the room. "Richard says he's very driven." "He certainly is," I agreed, taking a sip of my wine. "Sometimes I think his ambition is the most important thing in his life." Elena gave me a curious look. "You sound like you know him pretty well." This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the opening I needed to begin building the foundation of trust that would make everything else possible. "We dated for 3 years, I said casually. "Just broke up recently, actually. But we're staying friends." Elena's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh, I'm sorry, I had no idea. Was it amicable?" "Very," I said with a laugh that only sounded slightly bitter. "Marcus decided he needed to focus on his career right now. You know how demanding this industry can be." "I do indeed," Elena said dryly. "Sometimes I feel like I'm married to Morrison Associates first, and Richard second." We found ourselves gravitating toward each other throughout the evening, sharing observations about the other guests, and discovering that we had similar senses of humor about corporate social dynamics. Elena pointed out which wives looked bored, which junior associates were trying too hard to impress, and which senior partners had clearly had too much to drink. "See that woman over there in the red dress?" Elena whispered as we stood near the bar. "That's Janet Peterson. Her husband handles our biggest tech client, and she's been trying to get me to join her book club for 2 years. The last book they read was 50 Shades of Grey, and apparently the discussion got so heated that someone called it a night early." I laughed, genuinely enjoying Elena's company. It had been a long time since I'd connected with someone so easily, and I found myself forgetting that this evening had started as part of a larger plan. Elena was simply fun to be around. As the evening wound down, Richard Morrison took the stage to give a speech about the company's achievements and future goals. He was a distinguished man in his early 50s with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention. As he spoke about expanding into international markets and the bright future ahead for Morrison Associates, I watched Marcus hang on every word like it was gospel. "I want to especially thank my wife Elena," Richard said toward the end of his speech, "for her patience with my long hours and her support of everything we're building here. She's the reason I can focus on growing this company, and I'm grateful every day for her partnership." Elena smiled and waved from our table, but I caught a fleeting expression that suggested Richard's public gratitude might not translate to private appreciation. It was just a momentary tightening around her eyes, gone so quickly that someone who wasn't paying attention might have missed it entirely. After the speech, as guests began to filter out, Elena and I found ourselves standing outside the hotel waiting for our respective rides. The evening air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the city lights reflected off the wet pavement from an earlier rain shower. "Thank you so much for tonight," I said to Elena. "I had a wonderful time." "Me too," she replied warmly. "We should definitely do this again. Maybe next time somewhere with less corporate schmoozing and more actual conversation." "I'd love that." As my rideshare pulled up, Elena gave me a spontaneous hug. "I'm really glad we met, Sofia. I have a good feeling about our friendship." Sitting in the back of the car as it wound through Portland's quiet streets, I reflected on the evening. What had started as a strategic move to position myself in Marcus's professional world had evolved into something more complex. I genuinely liked Elena, and our connection felt real in a way that surprised me. She was intelligent, funny, and kind, but I'd also sensed an underlying loneliness that resonated with my own recent experience. As we pulled up to my apartment building, I realized that my plan had worked even better than I'd hoped. I wasn't just friends with Marcus's boss's wife now. I was friends with a woman who seemed to understand what it felt like to be taken for granted by the men in her life. The real question was what I was going to do with that information. Over the next few weeks, Elena and I developed a genuine friendship that extended far beyond our initial connection through Marcus and Morrison and Associates. We met for coffee, went to art galleries, and even planned a weekend hiking trip to the Columbia River Gorge. The more time I spent with her, the more I appreciated her intelligence and wit, but also the more I noticed the subtle signs of strain in her marriage. Elena never complained directly about Richard, but there were small comments that painted a picture of a relationship where she'd become more of a supporting player than an equal partner. He forgot their anniversary dinner because of a client crisis. He promised to attend her gallery opening but canceled last minute for a golf meeting with potential investors. He made major decisions about their social calendar without consulting her, assuming she'd be available whenever he needed her to play the role of the successful executive's wife. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just another item on Richard's to-do list," she confided to me one afternoon as we walked through Powell's books. "Take care of Elena, check. Make sure Elena's happy, check. But it's also perfunctory." I understood that feeling more deeply than she could know. It was exactly how I'd felt with Marcus during the last year of our relationship. Like I was a box to be checked, rather than a person to be loved. During this same period, Marcus had been true to his word about maintaining our friendship, though his version of friendship seemed to consist mainly of texting me when he needed something. He asked me to pick up dry cleaning he'd forgotten about, to water his plants when he went out of town for work, and to be his +1 to a wedding where he didn't want to go alone but couldn't bring his new girlfriend yet. Yes, there was definitely a new girlfriend, though Marcus hadn't admitted it directly. Her name was Vanessa, and she worked in marketing for a tech startup downtown. I'd learned this not from Marcus but from casual social media stalking that I justified as necessary intelligence gathering. She was blonde, ambitious, and based on her Instagram posts, very interested in expensive restaurants and weekend trips to wine country. I played the part of the understanding ex-girlfriend perfectly, offering advice about work stress and listening sympathetically when he complained about difficult clients. All the while, I was learning more about Marcus's professional life than I'd ever known during our relationship. He was working on several high-profile projects, including a major consulting contract with a tech company that was considering relocating their headquarters to Portland. The successful completion of this project would likely earn him the promotion he'd been chasing for years. Through Elena, I learned even more about the internal dynamics at Morrison Associates. Richard was under pressure from the board to show significant growth, and the international expansion he'd been promising was behind schedule and over budget. There were whispers about potential layoffs if the next quarter's numbers didn't improve, and several key clients were considering taking their business elsewhere. Marcus, it seemed, was positioning himself as the solution to many of these problems. He'd been taking credit for other people's ideas, promising clients deliverables that his team couldn't realistically provide, and generally operating with the kind of aggressive ambition that looked impressive in the short term but created problems down the line. "Richard's been so stressed lately," Elena told me over dinner one evening. "He says there are some personnel issues at work. People not pulling their weight or trying to advance themselves at the expense of the team. He's usually pretty diplomatic about work stuff, but I can tell he's frustrated with someone in particular." I filed this information away, along with everything else I was learning about the precarious balance of power and politics at Morrison and Associates. Marcus thought he was playing chess, but he didn't realize that other people could see the board too. The turning point came during a casual conversation with Elena about financial planning. We'd been discussing the cost of living in Kola, Portland, and how it had changed over the years when she mentioned that Richard had been working with a financial advisor to restructure some of their investments. "He's been moving money around, trying to optimize our portfolio," she said. "Something about tax advantages and international investment opportunities. I don't really understand all the details, but apparently it's connected to the company's expansion plans." This struck me as odd. In my experience, personal financial planning and business expansion were usually kept very separate, especially in a company the size of Morrison Associates. But I filed the information away and didn't think much more about it, until a few weeks later when Marcus mentioned something that made my mental alarm bells start ringing. We were having coffee at a cafe in the Alberta district when Marcus started complaining about the slow pace of decision-making at Morrison Associates. He was frustrated that Richard wasn't moving fast enough on the international opportunities, and he hinted that some aggressive financial maneuvering might be necessary to stay competitive. "Sometimes you have to be willing to take risks that other people aren't comfortable with," he said, stirring his latte with more force than necessary. "Richard's too conservative. He doesn't understand that in today's market you have to move fast or get left behind." "What kind of risks?" I asked innocently. Marcus glanced around the cafe and lowered his voice. "Let's just say there are ways to leverage existing resources to fund new opportunities. Creative accounting, you might call it. Perfectly legal, but not everyone has the vision to see the potential." A chill ran down my spine. "That sounds complicated." "It's only complicated if you don't understand how modern business works," Marcus said with that condescending tone I'd learned to hate. "But don't worry about it, Sofia. It's not really your area." After Marcus left to go back to work, I sat in the cafe for another hour, thinking about his words and trying to piece together what I'd learned from Elena about Richard's financial restructuring and what Marcus had just hinted about creative accounting and leveraging existing resources. I wasn't a financial expert, but I'd worked in marketing long enough to understand business basics. If Marcus was moving company money around to fund personal investments or international expansion that hadn't been properly approved, that could constitute embezzlement or fraud. If Richard was unknowingly involved because Marcus had convinced him to restructure investments using company funds, both of their careers could be destroyed. But if Richard was actively participating in questionable financial practices, that was an entirely different situation. Either way, Elena deserved to know what was happening, especially if her family's financial future was at risk. The question was how to approach this without revealing that I'd been deliberately cultivating our friendship for strategic reasons. Because somewhere along the way, my feelings toward Elena had become completely genuine. She wasn't just a means to an end anymore. She was a real friend, and the thought of potentially hurting her made me feel sick to my stomach. I decided to start slowly, testing the waters to see how much Elena actually knew about Richard's business practices and whether she had any suspicions of her own. The opportunity came the following weekend when Elena and I drove out to the Oregon coast for a girls' weekend that we'd been planning for weeks. We rented a small cottage in Cannon Beach and spent Saturday morning walking along the shore, collecting shells and talking about everything except work and relationships. It was exactly the kind of restorative experience I'd been craving, and I could see that Elena was relaxing in a way that suggested she really needed this break from her regular life. That evening, as we sat on the cottage's deck with a bottle of wine, watching the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of orange and pink, Elena brought up the subject of marriage and partnership in a way that felt like she'd been building up to it all day. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said, refilling our glasses. "Do you ever wonder if you stayed with someone too long? Like if you ignored red flags because you wanted the relationship to work so badly?" I thought about Marcus and the years I'd spent making excuses for his selfishness and emotional unavailability. "All the time," I said honestly. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately," Elena continued. "Richard and I have been married for 8 years, and sometimes I feel like I don't even know who he is anymore. Or maybe I'm just finally seeing who he's always been." This was the opening I had been waiting for, but I approached it carefully. "What do you mean?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching the waves crash against the rocks below us. "When we first met, Richard was different. More collaborative, more interested in my opinions and ideas. But as the business has grown, he's become so focused on success and status that everything else feels secondary, including me. That must be really lonely. It is. And lately, there have been things that make me wonder if he's hiding stuff from me. Important stuff that affects both of us. She took a sip of wine and seemed to be debating how much to share. He's been secretive about money, about business decisions, about where he goes and who he meets with. When I ask questions, he tells me not to worry about it, that it's complicated business stuff I wouldn't understand. My heart started racing. This was exactly what I'd been hoping to hear, but it also confirmed my worst fears about what Marcus might be involved in. That would make me nervous too. The thing is, I do understand business. I ran my own design company for 5 years before we moved to Portland. I'm not some naive housewife who doesn't know how money works. But Richard treats me like I am, and that makes me wonder what he thinks he needs to protect me from. Elena turned to look at me directly. Have you ever had the feeling that people in your life were making decisions that affected you without including you in the conversation? Yes, I said quietly. With Marcus, constantly. It's such a violation of trust, isn't it? Like, how can you build a life with someone who doesn't think you deserve to know what's really happening? We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in our own thoughts about the men who had disappointed us and the choices we'd made in response. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Elena, I said, there's something I need to tell you about Marcus and Richard's company. Something I think you should know. The words hung in the salty ocean air between us like a confession waiting to be born. Elena set down her wine glass and turned to face me fully, her expression shifting from contemplative to alert. In the fading light, I could see the wariness creeping into her eyes, the protective instinct of someone who had learned not to trust easily. What about Marcus and Richard's company? She asked quietly. I took a deep breath, knowing that once I crossed this line there would be no going back. Our friendship, which had become so precious to me, would either deepen into something unbreakable or shatter completely. But Elena deserved the truth, and after weeks of watching her struggle with her suspicions about Richard, I couldn't keep silent anymore. I think Marcus might be involved in some questionable financial practices at Morrison Associates, I said carefully. And I'm worried that Richard might either be involved or might be getting manipulated into something that could destroy both their careers. Elena's face went very still. What kind of questionable practices? I told her about Marcus's comments regarding creative accounting and leveraging existing resources, about his frustration with Richard's conservative approach to international expansion, and about the hints he'd dropped regarding taking risks that others weren't comfortable with. As I spoke, Elena's expression grew increasingly troubled. How long have you known about this? She asked when I finished. I only started putting the pieces together recently, I said honestly. Marcus has been more open about work stuff since we broke up, I think because he sees me as safe to talk to now. But Elena, I need you to know something else. She waited, and I could see her bracing herself for whatever revelation was coming next. When I first met you at yoga, it wasn't entirely by accident. I mean, meeting you was accidental, but going to that class, being in that neighborhood, I was trying to learn more about Marcus's work life. I was hurt and angry about how he broke up with me, and I wanted to understand the world he'd chosen over our relationship. Elena absorbed this information without immediate reaction, which somehow made me more nervous than if she'd exploded with anger. So our friendship, she said slowly, started as a way for you to get back at your ex-boyfriend. It started that way, I admitted, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. But Elena, everything between us since then has been completely real. You've become one of the most important people in my life. The last thing I want is to hurt you, which is why I'm telling you this now, instead of just keeping quiet about what I've learned. Elena stood up and walked to the deck railing, staring out at the dark ocean. I could hear the waves crashing below us and the distant cry of seagulls, but the silence between us felt deafening. I wanted to say something more, to explain or apologize or make promises, but I knew she needed time to process what I'd told her. After what felt like an eternity, Elena spoke without turning around. The financial restructuring Richard's been doing. He told me it was about optimizing our personal investments, but you think it might involve company money. I don't know for sure, I said. But the way Marcus talked about it, combined with what you've told me about Richard moving money around, it makes me nervous. Elena was quiet for another long moment. Then she turned back to face me, and I was surprised to see that she looked more determined than angry. "I need to know exactly what's happening," she said. "If Richard is involved in something illegal, or if Marcus is manipulating him into it, I need to understand the full scope before I decide what to do." "How can we find out?" Elena sat back down across from me, and I could see her mind working, organizing information and possibilities the way she probably approached design problems. "Richard keeps all his important documents in his home office: financial records, business contracts, correspondence with clients and partners. He's old-fashioned that way, likes to have physical copies of everything important." She paused, seeming to weigh her options. "He's traveling next week for a conference in Seattle, 3 days where I'll have access to everything." "Elena, I don't want you to do anything that could get you in trouble. If my husband is committing fraud with company funds, I'm already in trouble," she said grimly. "At minimum, I need to know whether our personal finances are at risk. At worst, I need to know if I'm going to be implicated in whatever he's doing." We spent the rest of the evening planning how Elena could safely investigate Richard's business dealings without alerting him to her suspicions. She would photograph relevant documents rather than taking them, focus on recent financial transactions and correspondence with Marcus, and be careful not to disturb anything in a way that would be noticeable. The drive back to Portland on Sunday was subdued, but not uncomfortable. Elena seemed lost in thought, and I found myself alternating between worry about what we might discover and guilt about how our friendship had begun. But there was also something else, something that felt like relief. For the first time in months, I wasn't carrying the weight of secrets and half-truths alone. Monday morning at work, I found it almost impossible to concentrate on my regular marketing tasks. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped, wondering if it was Elena with news or Marcus with some new request that would reveal more about his activities at Morrison Associates. By lunchtime, I'd accomplished almost nothing productive and had to stay late to catch up on the projects I'd neglected. Elena texted me Tuesday evening to confirm that Richard had left for Seattle and that she planned to begin her investigation the following day. The message was brief and factual, but I could sense the tension underneath her calm words. Wednesday passed with no communication from Elena, which I told myself was probably a good sign. If she'd discovered something immediately alarming, she would have reached out right away. The silence likely meant she was being thorough and careful, exactly as we'd planned. Thursday afternoon, my phone rang while I was in a client meeting. Elena's name flashed on the screen, and I excused myself to take the call in the hallway. "Sofia," Elena's voice was tight with controlled emotion. "I need to see you tonight. Can you come over around 8? "Of course. Are you okay?" "I will be, but we need to talk about what I found." Elena's house was a beautiful craftsman-style home in the Laurelhurst neighborhood, with a wraparound porch and mature trees that created privacy from the street. I'd been there several times for dinner parties and casual visits, but as I walked up the front steps that evening, it felt different somehow. More ominous. Elena opened the door before I could ring the bell, as if she'd been watching for my arrival. She looked tired and stressed, her usually perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and her face free of the light makeup she normally wore. "Thank you for coming," she said, leading me into the living room. "Can I get you some wine? I think we're both going to need it." She poured 2 generous glasses of red wine and settled onto the couch across from me, a manila folder thick with papers resting on the coffee table between us. "I found everything," Elena said without preamble. "Financial records, email correspondence, meeting notes, contracts. Richard has been documenting everything meticulously, which is going to make this either much easier or much worse depending on how you look at it." She opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers covered in her neat handwriting. I didn't want to risk copying or photographing anything too extensively, so I took detailed notes about the most important information. Elena's voice was steady, but I could see her hands trembling slightly as she shuffled through her notes. "Marcus has been systematically embezzling money from Morrison and Associates for the past 18 months, she continued. "Small amounts at first, a few thousand here and there, but escalating significantly in recent months. The total amount is just over $400,000. I felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. $400,000 was serious federal crime territory, the kind of theft that resulted in prison sentences and destroyed lives. How was he doing it? Multiple methods, but the primary one was creating fake consulting contracts with shell companies he set up. Morrison Associates would pay these companies for services that were never actually provided, and Marcus would then transfer the money to personal accounts. Elena flipped through her notes. He also manipulated expense reports, inflated billable hours on client projects, and charged personal expenses to company credit cards. And Richard? Elena's expression grew even more troubled. That's the complicated part. Richard isn't directly involved in the embezzlement, but Marcus has been using some of the stolen money to fund investments that he then presented to Richard as opportunities for the company's international expansion. She pulled out another sheet of notes. Marcus convinced Richard to invest company money in several overseas ventures, claiming they were legitimate business opportunities with guaranteed returns. In reality, Marcus was using these investments to launder the money he'd stolen, making it look like legitimate business profits. I tried to process what Elena was telling me. So Richard thinks he's making smart business investments, but he's actually helping Marcus cover up theft. Exactly. And because Richard authorized the international investments and signed off on the contracts, he would be legally liable, even though he doesn't know the money came from embezzlement. Elena set down her notes and looked at me directly. If this comes to light, Richard could face charges for money laundering and fraud, even though he's essentially another victim of Marcus's scheme. The magnitude of what Marcus had done was staggering. He hadn't just stolen money, he'd constructed an elaborate scheme that would destroy multiple lives while positioning himself to benefit from both the theft and the cover-up. There's more, Elena said quietly. I found correspondence between Marcus and several potential clients, including the tech company that's considering relocating to Portland. Marcus has been promising them services and rates that Morrison and Associates can't actually provide, using the stolen money to artificially lower bids and make the company more competitive. He's setting the entire company up for failure. Worse than that. When these contracts inevitably fall through, because the company can't deliver what Marcus promised, Morrison and Associates will face lawsuits, reputation damage, and financial ruin. Meanwhile, Marcus will probably position himself as the solution, offering to leave and take his innovative approaches to a competitor. I stared at Elena in amazement. Marcus hadn't just embezzled money. He'd orchestrated the systematic destruction of Morrison and Associates while making himself look like a visionary who was being held back by conservative leadership. How did you figure all this out? Elena gave me a wan smile. I spent 5 years running my own business, remember? I know how to read financial records and spot inconsistencies. Plus, Richard keeps meticulous records, so once I started looking for patterns, they became pretty obvious. We sat in silence for a few minutes, both absorbed in the implications of what Elena had discovered. I felt sick thinking about how I'd enabled Marcus by playing the supportive friend, listening to his complaints about Richard's conservative approach, without realizing he was describing his frustration with having to work around an honest boss. What are you going to do? I asked finally. Elena refilled our wine glasses, her movements careful and deliberate. I've been thinking about that all day. The obvious choice is to confront Richard immediately, tell him everything I found, and let him decide how to handle it. But if I do that, Richard will have to report Marcus to the authorities immediately. There won't be any opportunity to recover the stolen money or minimize the damage to the company. And Marcus will probably claim that Richard was involved all along, that he was just following orders. Elena stood up and began pacing the length of the living room, her wine glass forgotten on the table. The other option is to gather more evidence first. Maybe try to document Marcus's activities in real time. Build a case that clearly shows Richard was being manipulated rather than participating willingly. That sounds dangerous, I said. If Marcus realizes you're investigating him. I know, but Sofia, this isn't just about bringing Marcus to justice. It's about protecting Richard and saving Morrison and Associates if possible. 23 people work for that company. If it goes under because of Marcus's schemes, all of those families will suffer. I could see Elena wrestling with the weight of responsibility. trying to balance justice against pragmatism, personal safety against protecting others. It was exactly the kind of impossible situation that Marcus had created for everyone around him. What if there was a way to expose Marcus without putting you or Richard at risk? I asked slowly. Elena stopped pacing and looked at me. What do you mean? Marcus still thinks we're friends. He still tells me things because he thinks I'm safe, that I'm not smart enough or connected enough to do anything with the information he gives me. I could feel an idea forming, dangerous and complicated, but potentially effective. What if we used that? I'm not following. I stood up and joined Elena in the middle of the living room, my mind racing as the plan took shape. Marcus is arrogant. He thinks he's smarter than everyone around him, and he loves to show off. If I approached him the right way, made him think I was impressed by his business acumen and wanted to learn from him, he might reveal enough details for us to document his crimes without having to sneak around Richard's office. Elena's eyes widened as she understood what I was suggesting. You want to get him to confess. Not exactly confess, but brag. Marcus can't resist explaining how clever he is, especially to someone he thinks he's superior to. If I could get him talking about his innovative approaches to business, record the conversations. Sofia, that's incredibly risky. If Marcus realizes what you're doing, he won't, I said with more confidence than I felt, because he genuinely believes I'm too simple to understand what he's really talking about. He's been condescending to me for years, explaining things like I'm a child who needs everything broken down into simple terms. Elena sat back down heavily, considering the implications of what I was proposing. Even if you could get him to incriminate himself, how would we use that information? You can't exactly take a recording to the police and say you tricked your ex-boyfriend into confessing to embezzlement. No, but we could take it to Richard. If he had clear evidence that Marcus was stealing from the company and manipulating him, he could confront Marcus directly, maybe even get him to return the stolen money in exchange for not pressing charges. And if Marcus refuses, then Richard reports him to the authorities, but with evidence that clearly shows Richard was a victim rather than an accomplice. Elena was quiet for a long time, staring at the folder of financial records on the coffee table. I could see her weighing the risks and benefits, considering all the ways this plan could go wrong. There's something else to consider, she said finally. If we do this, if we actively work to expose Marcus, our friendship becomes something different. It becomes a conspiracy. Her words hit me like a cold splash of water. She was right, of course. What I was proposing would transform our relationship from friendship with complicated origins into an active partnership in bringing down Marcus. There would be no pretending anymore that our connection was purely personal. I know, I said quietly, and I understand if you don't want to risk that. Elena, you've already done more than enough by investigating and sharing what you found. You don't owe me anything, and you don't have to get involved in whatever comes next. That's not what I meant, Elena said, looking up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I meant that if we do this together, we need to be completely honest with each other going forward. No more secrets, no more hidden agendas. If we're going to take down someone as smart and dangerous as Marcus, we need to trust each other completely. The weight of her words settled over me. Elena was offering me exactly what I'd been afraid to hope for. A genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose. She was also asking me to be vulnerable in a way that terrified me. Can I tell you something? I asked. Elena nodded. I've been alone for so long. Even when I was with Marcus, I felt alone because he never really saw me or valued my opinions. And after we broke up, I was so focused on being angry at him that I didn't realize how much I missed having someone to trust, someone who understood me. I took a shaky breath. Meeting you, becoming your friend, it's been the best thing that's happened to me in years. And I'm terrified that if we do this, if we go after Marcus together, I'll lose that. Elena smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her all evening. Sofia, do you really think I'd risk everything to help you bring down your ex-boyfriend if I didn't consider you family at this point? The word family hit me. unexpectedly hard. I'd been so focused on strategy and justice and protecting Elena from Marcus's schemes that I hadn't fully processed what our friendship had become. Elena wasn't just helping me get revenge on an ex who'd wronged me. She was protecting someone she cared about from a person who'd manipulated both of us. "Okay," I said, feeling something settle into place inside my chest. "Let's do this. But Elena, we're going to be smart about it. We're going to plan every step, have backup plans for the backup plans, and make sure we protect ourselves and Richard as much as possible." "Agreed. And Sofia? When this is all over, whatever happens, we're still going to be friends. Probably better friends, because we'll have been through something like this together." That night, we stayed up until almost 3 in the morning, planning every detail of how I would approach Marcus and what information we needed to gather. Elena's notes from Richard's office provided a roadmap of what to look for, and my knowledge of Marcus's personality and ego gave us insight into how to manipulate him into revealing incriminating details. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would reach out to Marcus and tell him I was considering a career change, maybe getting into consulting or business development. I'd ask for his advice and guidance, playing up my admiration for his success and innovation. Marcus wouldn't be able to resist the opportunity to mentor someone, especially someone he'd already demonstrated his superiority over. During these conversations, I would gradually steer the discussion toward more specific business practices, asking him to explain the creative approaches he'd mentioned before. With any luck, his need to impress me would override his caution about revealing too much. Elena and I would meet regularly to compare notes and adjust our approach based on what I learned. She would continue monitoring Richard's records to track any new suspicious activity, and we'd both watch for signs that Marcus was becoming suspicious of our interest in his work. It wasn't a perfect plan, and there were dozens of ways it could backfire spectacularly. But it was better than doing nothing, and it gave us some measure of control over a situation that had spiraled far beyond what either of us had initially imagined. As I drove home through Portland's empty streets, I felt a strange combination of excitement and terror. For the first time since Marcus had broken up with me, I was taking active control of my life, rather than just responding to other people's choices. It was terrifying, but it was also liberating. I also realized that somewhere along the way, this had stopped being about getting revenge on Marcus for hurting me. Now it was about protecting Elena and Richard and the other employees at Morrison Associates from someone who was systematically destroying their lives for his own benefit. Marcus had made the mistake of underestimating both Elena and me. He'd seen us as supporting characters in his story, people who existed to make his life easier or more comfortable. He'd never considered that we might have our own agency, our own intelligence, our own capacity for strategic thinking. He was about to learn how wrong he'd been. The next morning, I sent Marcus a carefully crafted text message that struck exactly the right tone of casual friendliness mixed with professional curiosity. "Hey Marcus, hope you're doing well. I've been thinking a lot about my career lately and wondering if I should consider making a move into consulting. You always make it sound so exciting and challenging. Would you be up for coffee sometime this week? Would love to pick your brain about the industry." He responded within an hour, as I'd known he would. Marcus could never resist the opportunity to position himself as an expert, especially when the person asking for advice was someone he felt superior to. "Of course. Always happy to help a friend navigate their career. How about Thursday at that place in Alberta we used to go to? Say 3 p.m.? Perfect." The cafe in Alberta was casual and noisy, exactly the kind of place where people had business conversations, without thinking twice about who might be listening. I spent the next 2 days preparing for the conversation, reviewing Elena's notes, and practicing how to ask leading questions without seeming suspicious. Thursday afternoon, I arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early and chose a table in the corner where I could easily record our conversation on my phone without being obvious about it. When Marcus walked in, I was struck again by how polished and confident he looked. Success suited him, and he wore his expensive clothes and perfect haircut like armor that announced his status to everyone around him. "Sofia," he said, giving me a hug that felt performative, like he was aware of other people watching and wanted to project the image of someone who maintained friendly relationships with his exes. "You look great. That color really suits you." It was exactly the kind of comment Marcus always made, something that sounded like a compliment but was actually a reminder that he felt entitled to judge my appearance. A few months ago, it would have made me self-conscious. Now it just confirmed that my plan was likely to work. We ordered coffee and spent the first few minutes catching up on safe topics like work and mutual friends. Marcus told me about a recent business trip to San Francisco and complained about how exhausting it was to constantly travel for client meetings. I told him about some recent projects at my marketing firm and asked appropriate questions about his work. When the conversation reached a natural lull, I made my move. Marcus, can I ask you something? I've been watching how successful you've become over the past few years, and I'm really impressed by how you've managed to advance so quickly. What's your secret? Marcus's entire posture changed. He sat up straighter, his voice took on the tone he used when giving presentations, and I could see him mentally shifting into mentor mode. Well, it's really about understanding that business today requires innovation and creative thinking. A lot of people in consulting are stuck in old models, afraid to take risks or try new approaches. He leaned forward, warming to his favorite topic. The key is recognizing opportunities that other people miss and having the courage to act on them. That sounds amazing, but also kind of intimidating. How do you even identify those opportunities? Experience mostly. And being willing to look at problems from different angles. Marcus signaled the waitress for another coffee, clearly settling in for a long explanation. For example, most consultants focus on helping clients optimize their existing operations, but the real money is in helping them access new markets and funding sources they didn't know were available. This was promising. I could see Marcus working up to more specific examples, and I needed to encourage him without seeming too eager. That makes sense in theory, but how does it work in practice? Like, what kind of funding sources? Marcus glanced around the cafe, then leaned closer to me across the small table. This is confidential, obviously, but I've been working on some international investment opportunities that most people in Portland don't even know exist. Emerging markets, cryptocurrency, overseas development projects. The kind of high-yield investments that can transform a company's financial position almost overnight. Wow, that sounds incredibly sophisticated. How did you even learn about opportunities like that? Research, networking, being willing to take calculated risks when other people are too conservative. Marcus was fully in lecture mode now, his voice taking on the evangelical tone he used when discussing business strategy. The problem with most consulting firms is that they're run by people who are afraid of innovation. They'd rather stick with safe, traditional approaches even if it means missing out on potentially transformative opportunities. I thought about Elena's notes detailing how Marcus had used stolen money to fund fake international investments, and I had to work to keep my expression neutral. It must be frustrating to work for people who don't share your vision, I said sympathetically. You have no idea. Marcus's voice carried a note of genuine frustration that I'd heard many times during our relationship. Richard Morrison is a perfect example. Good guy, solid businessman, but completely risk-averse. He's so worried about protecting what the company already has that he can't see the potential for exponential growth. Have you tried explaining these opportunities to him? Of course, but you have to be strategic about how you present new ideas to conservative leadership. Sometimes you have to demonstrate success on a smaller scale before they'll trust you with larger investments. Marcus paused to drink his coffee, and I could see him deciding how much to reveal. I've actually been piloting some of these international opportunities using discretionary funds from various projects. Nothing major, just enough to prove the concept. Discretionary funds. That was Marcus's euphemism for the money he'd embezzled. I felt a surge of excitement, as I realized he was essentially confessing to financial fraud, while thinking he was impressing me with his business acumen. That's brilliant, I said, hoping I sounded appropriately odd. So you're basically creating proof of concept for larger investments? Exactly. And the results have been incredible. I've generated returns that are 3 to 4 times what we'd see from traditional investment vehicles. Marcus was becoming increasingly animated as he described his supposed successes. The challenge now is convincing Richard to scale up these approaches across the entire company. I knew from Elena's research that these incredible returns were fictional, created by moving stolen money between accounts to make it look like legitimate investment profits. But Marcus seemed completely convinced by his own story, which suggested that he'd been lying to himself as much as to everyone else. This all sounds amazing, Marcus, but I have to ask, isn't it risky to pilot investments without full approval from leadership? What if something went wrong? For the first time during our conversation, Marcus looked slightly uncomfortable. But rather than backing down, he doubled down on his justifications. Look, Sofia, this is the reality of modern business. If you wait for every decision to go through committee and get approved by people who don't understand innovative financing, you'll never accomplish anything significant. He leaned back in his chair, his expression taking on the condescending tone I remembered so well. Sometimes leadership means taking initiative and accepting responsibility for results, even if the process isn't completely traditional. I wanted to scream at him that what he was describing wasn't leadership, it was theft. But I forced myself to maintain my admiring expression and ask the question that would hopefully get him to reveal the most incriminating details. I'm really curious about the mechanics of how this works. Like, how do you actually access these international investment opportunities? Do you work with specific firms or platforms? Marcus seemed to consider whether to answer, probably weighing his desire to impress me against his instinct for self-preservation. Unfortunately for him, his ego won. There are several approaches, depending on the specific opportunity. Sometimes I work directly with overseas development firms that need short-term capital infusions. Other times I utilize cryptocurrency exchanges that allow for rapid international transfers. He was speaking more quietly now, but I could tell he was enjoying the opportunity to demonstrate his sophistication. The key is maintaining flexibility in funding sources so you can move quickly when opportunities arise. Funding sources meaning? Project budgets, client advance payments, operational reserves, anything that's available for discretionary use. Marcus waved his hand dismissively. Most consulting firms have significant cash flow at any given time. The art is in leveraging those resources for maximum benefit while maintaining operational stability. I felt like I was watching someone dig their own grave while thinking they were building a monument to their intelligence. Marcus had just described embezzling client money and operational funds in language that made it sound like innovative financial management. That's fascinating, I said, checking the time on my phone. Marcus, I could listen to you talk about this stuff all day, but I know you're busy. Can I ask you one more question? Of course. If someone wanted to get into this kind of work, what would you recommend as a first step? I mean, obviously, I'd need to learn a lot more about international finance and investment strategies. Marcus's expression shifted into what I could only describe as predatory excitement. He was seeing an opportunity, though I wasn't sure yet what kind. Well, there are certainly educational resources available, but honestly, the best way to learn this business is through direct experience, working with someone who already understands the landscape. He paused, clearly building up to something. Actually, Sofia, I might have an interesting opportunity for someone with your marketing background and willingness to learn. My heart started racing, but I tried to keep my voice casual. What kind of opportunity? I'm in the early stages of developing a new consulting venture, something focused specifically on helping smaller firms access international investment opportunities. It would be separate from my work at Morrison Associates, obviously, but it could be incredibly lucrative for the right people. A new consulting venture funded by stolen money. Marcus wasn't just embezzling from his current employer. He was planning to use the proceeds to start a competing business. The scope of his scheme was even larger than Elena and I had realized. That sounds incredible, Marcus. What would something like that involve? Initially, it would be about building relationships with potential clients and investment partners. Marketing and business development, exactly the kind of work you're already doing but on a much larger scale. Marcus was speaking faster now, clearly excited about his vision. And, Sofia, I have to say, having someone I trust handling the client relations side would be huge for me. Someone who understands discretion and the importance of protecting sensitive business information. He was offering me a job in his embezzlement scheme, probably thinking that my loyalty to him and lack of financial sophistication would make me an ideal accomplice. The audacity was breathtaking. Marcus, wow. I'm honestly flattered that you'd think of me for something like that. I tried to project enthusiasm while my mind raced through the implications of what he'd just proposed. When would something like this get started? Soon, I hope. I'm still working out some of the details around funding and business structure, but if everything goes according to plan, we could be operational within the next few months. And the funding would come from? Marcus hesitated for just a moment, and I could see him calculating how much to reveal. A combination of sources, personal investment, some strategic partnerships I've been developing, maybe some seed funding from satisfied clients who want to invest in proven strategies. Satisfied clients who had no idea their money was being stolen. Strategic partnerships that existed only in Marcus's imagination. Personal investment funded by embezzled money. It was like listening to someone describe a house of cards as if it were an architectural masterpiece. This all sounds amazing, Marcus. Can I think about it and get back to you? Of course. Take all the time you need. But Sofia, I hope you'll seriously consider it. This could be life-changing for both of us. As Marcus left the cafe to head back to work, I sat alone at our table, staring at my phone and the recording of our conversation. In the space of an hour, Marcus had essentially confessed to embezzling money from Morrison Associates, described his plans to use the stolen funds to start a competing business, and offered to make me an accomplice in his scheme. I had exactly what Elena and I needed to expose him. The question now was how to use it. I drove straight to Elena's house after leaving the cafe, my hands shaking slightly as I gripped the steering wheel. The recording on my phone felt like it was burning a hole through my purse, and I couldn't stop replaying Marcus's words in my head. The casual way he described stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars, his complete lack of remorse, and worst of all, his assumption that I would be thrilled to become his accomplice. Elena opened her front door before I could knock, as if she'd been watching for my arrival. One look at my face told her everything she needed to know. He confessed, she said, stepping aside to let me in. He more than confessed. Elena, he offered me a job in his new company that he's planning to fund with stolen money. I followed her into the living room, pulling out my phone with trembling fingers. I recorded everything. We sat together on her couch as I played back the conversation, Elena's expression growing increasingly grim as Marcus's voice filled the room. When he began describing his plans for the new consulting venture, Elena actually gasped. He's not just stealing from Morrison and Associates, she said when the recording ended. He's planning to destroy the company entirely and use the proceeds to start his own firm. And he wants me to help him do it, I said, feeling sick. Elena, he actually thinks I'm stupid enough and loyal enough to become his partner in crime. Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring at my phone as if it contained evidence of something far worse than financial fraud. Which, in a way, it did. Marcus's recording revealed not just criminal activity, but a complete absence of conscience, a willingness to destroy the lives of everyone around him in service of his own ambition. We have to tell Richard, Elena said finally. Tonight, as soon as he gets back from Seattle. Are you sure? Once we do this, there's no going back. Your marriage, your life, everything changes. Elena stood up and walked to the window, looking out at her perfectly manicured garden. Sofia, my marriage has been built on lies for months, maybe years. Richard's been making decisions based on false information that Marcus provided, using our family's financial security to fund investments that don't exist. Even if Richard never faces criminal charges, his reputation and career are going to be destroyed when this comes out. She turned back to face me, and I could see a steely determination in her eyes that I'd never witnessed before. But if we present this evidence to Richard now, tonight, before Marcus has a chance to steal any more money or manipulate any more investors, we might be able to minimize the damage. Richard can take control of the situation instead of being blindsided by federal investigators. What if he doesn't believe us? What if he thinks we're making this up? Then we take the recording to the FBI ourselves, Elena said without hesitation. But Richard deserves the chance to hear this first, to understand what's been happening before his world falls apart. Richard arrived home just after 9 o'clock, looking tired and stressed from his business trip. I watched from the living room as Elena met him at the front door, her voice low and urgent as she explained that they needed to talk immediately, that I was there because it involved information about his company. When Richard walked into the living room, I was struck by how different he looked from the confident executive I'd seen at the corporate gala. Travel fatigue had softened his usual polished appearance, and there was something vulnerable about the way he looked between Elena and me, clearly trying to understand why his wife's friend was sitting in his living room at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night. "Richard," Elena said, settling beside him on the couch opposite me, "Sofia has uncovered some information about Marcus Rivera that you need to hear." I watched Richard's expression shift from confusion to wariness. "What kind of information?" "The kind that involves federal crimes and could destroy Morrison Associates if it's not handled properly," Elena said quietly. "For the depropriety olate bor." Next hour, I walked Richard through everything we'd discovered, starting with Marcus's hints about creative accounting and leading up to the recording from that afternoon. Elena supplemented my account with details from her investigation of his financial records, painting a comprehensive picture of Marcus's systematic theft and manipulation. Richard listened without interruption, his face growing paler as the scope of Marcus's betrayal became clear. When I played the recording of our conversation, he closed his eyes as if the sound of Marcus's voice was physically painful. $400,000, he said when I finished. "He's stolen $400,000 from my company and made me an unwitting accomplice in money laundering." "Richard," Elena said gently, "you're a victim here too. Marcus manipulated you into authorizing investments using stolen money. Any competent attorney will be able to prove that you had no knowledge of the theft." "Maybe," Richard said, running his hands through his hair. "But my company authorized international investments based on fraudulent information. We paid invoices for services that were never provided. Even if I'm not criminally liable, the reputation damage alone could destroy everything my father built." I could see the weight of responsibility settling on Richard's shoulders as he contemplated the destruction Marcus had caused. 23 employees, client relationships built over decades, a family business that had taken 2 generations to establish, all of it threatened by one man's greed and ambition. "What are my options?" Richard asked, looking between Elena and me as if we might have answers to an impossible situation. "You could confront Marcus directly," I said. "Try to get him to return the stolen money in exchange for not pressing charges. Or you could report him to the authorities immediately and let them handle the investigation," Elena added. "Or," I said slowly, an idea beginning to form, "we could set a trap." Richard and Elena both looked at me with confusion. "Marcus offered me a job in his new consulting venture," I continued. "He thinks I'm interested in learning about international finance and that I trust him completely. What if I told him I wanted to accept his offer? What if I convinced him to show me exactly how his operation works?" "Absolutely not," Elena said immediately. "Sofia, that's incredibly dangerous. If Marcus realizes you're gathering evidence against him, he won't realize it because he thinks I'm too stupid to understand what he's really doing," I said. "Elena, you heard that recording. Marcus genuinely believes I'm impressed by his business acumen. He wants to use me because he thinks I'm loyal and naive." Richard was looking at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I tell Marcus I'm interested in his job offer, but that I need to understand the business better before I commit. I ask him to walk me through his investment strategies, maybe even show me some of the accounts and transactions. If we can get him to demonstrate his embezzlement techniques while thinking he's training his new partner, we'd have evidence that goes way beyond a single recorded conversation." "The risk is enormous," Elena said. "If Marcus suspects anything—" "The risk is enormous if we don't do anything too," I pointed out. "Marcus is planning to escalate his theft to fund a new company. How much more money will he steal while we're debating the safest way to stop him?" Richard was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the options. Finally, he looked up at both of us with an expression of grim determination. "If Sofia is willing to do this, and if we can set it up safely, it might be our best chance to gather enough evidence to ensure Marcus faces serious consequences while protecting Morrison and Associates from further damage." "Richard," Elena said, "I need you to understand that if we do this, if we actively work to entrap Marcus, we're taking on significant legal and personal risks. Are you prepared for that?" "Elena, Marcus has been stealing from my company for 18 months. He's manipulated me into unwittingly participating in money laundering. He's planning to use stolen funds to start a competing business that will probably destroy everything my family has worked for." Richard's voice was steady, but I could hear the anger underneath. I'm not going to let him walk away from this with a slap on the wrist while good people lose their jobs because of his crimes. We spent the next 2 hours planning exactly how I would approach Marcus and what information we needed to gather. Elena would continue monitoring Richard's financial records to track any new suspicious activity. Richard would document everything from his end, creating a paper trail that clearly showed when he discovered the theft and what steps he took in response. I would reach out to Marcus within the next few days, expressing enthusiasm about his job offer and asking for more details about how his new venture would operate. If he took the bait, I would push for increasingly specific information about his financial strategies and investment approaches. The goal is to get him to demonstrate his methods, while thinking he's impressing a potential business partner, Richard said. But Sofia, the moment you feel unsafe or suspect that Marcus is becoming suspicious, you end the operation immediately. Agreed, I said, though privately I was terrified about what I'd committed to doing. As I drove home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about how dramatically my life had changed in just a few months. 6 months ago, I'd been a woman who defined herself primarily through her relationship with a man who didn't value her. I'd been passive, accommodating, always trying to make other people happy at the expense of my own needs and desires. Now I was actively planning to take down someone who had committed serious federal crimes, working in partnership with 2 people who had become more important to me than Marcus had ever been. It was terrifying, but it was also empowering in a way I'd never experienced before. The next morning, I sent Marcus a carefully crafted text message designed to signal my interest in his job offer without seeming too eager. "Hey Marcus, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I'm really intrigued by the opportunity you mentioned. I'd love to learn more about how international consulting works. Do you have time to talk more about it this week?" He responded within minutes, clearly excited that his recruitment effort was succeeding. "Absolutely. This could be perfect timing, actually. I'm putting together some materials about the new venture that I could show you. How about dinner Friday night? Somewhere nice where we can talk business properly." Dinner at somewhere nice. Marcus was already spending money he hadn't earned yet, probably planning to use a company credit card to pay for a meal where he would try to recruit me into his criminal enterprise. The irony was almost too perfect. I agreed to meet him at an upscale restaurant in the Pearl District, the kind of place Marcus liked to go when he wanted to impress people. As I confirmed the details, I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread about what I was walking into. Friday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth for October in Portland. I chose my outfit carefully, wanting to look professional but not so sophisticated that Marcus might start questioning my supposed naivete about business. I settled on a simple black dress with a blazer, elegant enough for the restaurant but conservative enough to maintain my carefully cultivated image as someone who needed his guidance. The restaurant Marcus had chosen was exactly what I'd expected. Exposed brick walls, dim lighting, and prices that reflected its status as a place where important business conversations happened. Marcus was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, 2 manila folders and a tablet arranged beside his place setting like props in a presentation. "Sofia, you look beautiful," he said, standing to give me a hug that lasted slightly too long. "I'm so excited to talk about this opportunity with you." As we settled into our seats and ordered wine, I noticed that Marcus seemed more animated than I'd seen him in months. His eyes were bright with excitement, and he moved with the energy of someone who was about to share something he was incredibly proud of. "Before we get into the details," Marcus said, opening one of the folders, "I want you to see some of the results I've achieved with the international investment strategies we discussed." He slid a sheet of paper across the table, covered with numbers and percentages that were designed to look like legitimate financial reports. According to the document, Marcus's innovative approaches had generated returns of over 300% on initial investments, with projected annual profits in the millions. "This is incredible," I said, though I knew from Elena's research that these numbers were completely fabricated. "How did you achieve returns like this?" "Strategic diversification across emerging markets, cryptocurrency arbitrage, and some proprietary trading algorithms I've developed," Marcus said, clearly proud of his fictional accomplishments. "But Sofia, this is just the beginning. With the right team and adequate funding, We could scale these approaches to generate truly transformational wealth. As Marcus walked me through his fantasy business plan, I found myself amazed by the elaborate fiction he'd constructed. He'd created fake investment portfolios, invented international partners, and developed detailed projections for a company that existed only in his imagination and funded entirely by stolen money. The key, Marcus continued, pulling out his tablet to show me what appeared to be trading platforms and investment accounts, is maintaining flexibility with funding sources and being willing to move quickly when opportunities arise. He showed me screenshots of accounts that contained hundreds of thousands of dollars, numbers that would have been impressive if I didn't know they represented money stolen from Richard's company. Marcus narrated each screen as if he were a professor teaching a masterclass in innovative finance. This particular account is funded through strategic reallocation of operational resources, he said, pointing to a balance of over $150,000. And this one represents profits from cryptocurrency trades executed using temporarily available project funds. Temporarily available project funds. It was such a clinical way to describe embezzlement that I almost laughed out loud. Marcus had convinced himself that stealing money was just creative resource management. Marcus, this is all fascinating, but I have to ask, how do you access these operational resources and project funds? Don't you need approval from Morrison and Associates for major financial decisions? Marcus's expression shifted into what I recognized as his teaching mode. Sophia, this is where understanding modern business becomes crucial. In today's economy, waiting for every decision to go through traditional approval processes means missing opportunities that could benefit everyone. He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if he were sharing proprietary trade secrets. The art is in identifying funds that can be temporarily redirected without impacting day-to-day operations. Client advance payments, budget surpluses from completed projects, operational reserves that aren't immediately needed. The key is ensuring that any temporary reallocation generates enough profit to cover the original amount, plus significant additional returns. I felt like I was watching someone describe murder as aggressive conflict resolution. Marcus had created an entire vocabulary that made his crimes sound like innovative business practices. But what if something goes wrong? What if an investment doesn't generate the expected returns? For the first time during our conversation, Marcus looked slightly uncomfortable. But instead of acknowledging the risks, he doubled down on his justifications. That's why diversification is so important, and why you only work with proven strategies that have demonstrated consistent success. Sophia, I've been doing this for over a year, and every single investment has exceeded projections. Of course they had exceeded projections, because the projections were fictional and the profits were just stolen money moved between accounts. But Marcus seemed completely convinced by his own narrative. Now, Marcus said, opening the second folder, let me show you how you would fit into this operation. He pulled out what appeared to be an organizational chart for his planned consulting company, complete with titles, responsibilities, and projected salaries that took my breath away. According to the document, I would start as Director of Client Relations, with a base salary of $120,000 plus bonuses based on the company's performance. Your primary responsibility would be managing relationships with our investment clients, Marcus explained. These are individuals and small companies who want to access the same international opportunities that larger firms monopolize. You'd help them understand our strategies and ensure they're comfortable with the level of returns we can generate. Investment clients who would be funding Marcus's scheme without realizing their money was being stolen. I was looking at a business plan for a Ponzi scheme disguised as an international consulting firm. This salary seems incredibly generous for someone with my experience level, I said, hoping to prompt Marcus to reveal more about his funding sources. Sophia, when you're generating the kind of returns I've achieved, employee compensation becomes a minor expense compared to overall profits. Plus, having someone I trust handling client relations is worth far more than whatever we pay you. Marcus spent the next hour walking me through every aspect of his planned operation, from the fake international partnerships to the imaginary trading algorithms. He showed me rental agreements for office space he planned to lease, marketing materials for services that didn't exist, and financial projections that bore no relationship to reality. What struck me most was how completely Marcus believed in his own story. He wasn't just lying to me. He'd constructed an elaborate fantasy in which he was a brilliant entrepreneur who had discovered revolutionary approaches to international finance. The fact that his success was built entirely on theft seemed to be something he'd managed to rationalize out of existence. When would this all get started? I asked as Marcus began putting his materials back into the folders. Soon, I hope. I'm finalizing some of the funding arrangements, but we could be operational within the next month. Marcus signaled for the check, clearly pleased with how the evening had gone. Sofia, I have to say I'm really excited about the possibility of working with you on this. You ask good questions, and I think you have the right instincts for this kind of work. As Marcus paid for dinner with what I assumed was a company credit card, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and revulsion. The evening had been a complete success, from an intelligence-gathering perspective. I had recorded hours of Marcus describing his embezzlement schemes in detail, including specific account numbers, funding sources, and plans for future theft. But I also felt sick knowing that Marcus genuinely believed I would be thrilled to help him steal money from innocent investors. He'd looked at me across the table and seen someone who could be easily manipulated into criminal activity, someone whose loyalty could be bought with a generous salary and promises of easy wealth. I'll be in touch early next week with some additional materials, Marcus said as we stood outside the restaurant. And Sofia, I probably don't need to say this, but everything we discussed tonight is obviously confidential. The competitive advantages we've developed depend on maintaining discretion about our methods. Of course, I said, managing to smile as Marcus gave me another uncomfortably long hug goodbye. As I drove home, I called Elena to let her know the meeting had been successful, and that I would have a full report for her and Richard the next morning. But I also felt a deep sadness about what Marcus had become, or maybe about finally seeing clearly what he had always been. The man I'd loved for 3 years, the person I'd planned to build a life with, was a criminal who felt no remorse about destroying other people's lives for his own benefit. He'd been willing to manipulate Richard, steal from his colleagues, and recruit me as an accomplice, all while maintaining the charming facade that had fooled me for so long. Saturday morning, I met Elena and Richard at their house to review the recording and plan our next steps. As we listened to Marcus's voice describing his elaborate schemes, Richard's expression grew increasingly grim. He's not just stealing from the company, Richard said when the recording ended. He's planning to use our client list, our business relationships, and our reputation to launch a competing firm funded entirely by money he stole from us. And he's assuming that the international investments will continue generating fictional profits to cover the theft, Elena added. What happens when clients start asking for their money back? The whole thing collapses, I said. Which is probably when Marcus disappears to some country without extradition treaties, leaving everyone else to face the consequences. Richard stood up and walked to his home office, returning with a thick folder of documents. I've been documenting everything since Thursday night. Every suspicious transaction, every questionable investment, every invoice that doesn't match the services provided. Combined with Sofia's recordings, we have enough evidence to prove systematic embezzlement and fraud. What's our next step? Elena asked. Richard looked at both of us with an expression of steely determination. Monday morning, I'm calling the FBI. On Monday morning, Special Agent Jennifer Walsh from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit arrived at Morrison Associates at exactly 9 o'clock. Richard had arranged for the meeting to take place in the conference room, away from the main office where Marcus and other employees might overhear the conversation. I arrived shortly after Agent Walsh, carrying copies of all my recordings and notes from my conversations with Marcus. Elena joined us a few minutes later, bringing her detailed analysis of the financial documents she'd found in Richard's office. Agent Walsh was a woman in her early 40s, with short, gray hair, and the kind of focused intensity that suggested she'd seen every type of financial crime imaginable. As we walked her through our evidence, she took detailed notes and asked pointed questions about dates, amounts, and specific methods Marcus had used to steal and launder money. Mr. Morrison, Agent Walsh said when we finished our presentation, you should know that your decision to report this immediately and provide comprehensive documentation will work strongly in your favor if there are any questions about your involvement. It's clear that you've been manipulated and that you took appropriate action as soon as you discovered the fraud. What happens next? Richard asked. We'll begin a full investigation immediately. Mr. Rivera will be arrested, probably today, and will freeze all accounts associated with his activities. The stolen money will be recovered where possible, though some of it may be difficult to trace if it's been moved through cryptocurrency exchanges or offshore accounts. Agent Walsh turned to look at me. Ms. Chen, I want you to know that what you've done here is incredibly valuable. The recordings you obtained provide clear evidence of intent and methodology that would have taken us months to develop through traditional investigation. What should I do if Marcus contacts me? Nothing. Don't respond to calls or texts. Don't meet with him. Don't give him any indication that you've reported his activities. He'll probably figure out pretty quickly that his arrest is connected to your investigation, but we don't want to give him any advance warning. As Agent Walsh prepared to leave, she handed Richard her business card and assured him that the FBI would work to minimize the impact on Morrison Associates, legitimate business operations. Mr. Morrison, I've seen cases like this before. Companies that act quickly and cooperate fully with the investigation usually emerge stronger than they were before the fraud occurred. Your employees and clients will respect the fact that you took decisive action to protect their interests. Marcus was arrested at his apartment that afternoon while I was at work. Elena called to tell me the news, her voice shaking with relief and residual adrenaline from the morning's events. It's over, she said. The FBI found evidence of over $600,000 in stolen funds across multiple accounts. Marcus had been escalating his theft over the past few months, probably to fund his new company. How is Richard handling it? Better than I expected. He's focused on protecting the other employees and maintaining client relationships. I think having control over the situation instead of being blindsided by it is helping him cope. That evening, I received a series of increasingly frantic text messages from Marcus, sent from jail where he was being held pending arraignment. Sofia, there's been a huge misunderstanding. I need you to call my lawyer. This is all a mistake. Richard is trying to frame me for his own financial problems. I know you don't understand business, but I never did anything illegal. Everything I did was to help the company. Please call me back. I need someone I can trust right now. I showed the messages to Elena when she called to check on me. He still thinks you might help him, she said with amazement. Even after being arrested for embezzlement, he thinks you're naive enough to believe his lies. I think Marcus actually believes his own lies at this point, I said. He's convinced himself that stealing money was just innovative business strategy. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal proceedings, media coverage, and gradual healing for everyone affected by Marcus's crimes. The local business journal ran a front-page story about the embezzlement scheme, praising Richard's quick action and cooperation with federal investigators. Morrison Associates not only survived the scandal, but actually gained several new clients who were impressed by the company's ethical response to discovering fraud within their organization. Richard implemented new financial oversight procedures and hired an additional accountant to ensure that no single employee could manipulate the company's finances again. Elena and I became closer than ever, bonded by our shared experience of uncovering and stopping Marcus's crimes. Our friendship had been tested by deception, strengthened by trust, and ultimately proven unbreakable by adversity. Marcus was eventually sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to Morrison Associates. During his sentencing hearing, he maintained that he had been trying to help the company and that his methods had been misunderstood by people who didn't appreciate innovative business practices. As I sat in the courtroom listening to Marcus blame everyone except himself for the destruction he'd caused, I felt a profound sense of closure. The man who had broken up with me because he needed to focus on his career had destroyed that career through his own greed and arrogance. The person who had treated me like I was too simple to understand his sophisticated business world had been outsmarted by the woman he'd underestimated. But more than revenge or vindication, what I felt was gratitude. Marcus's betrayal had forced me to discover my own strength, to build genuine friendships based on mutual respect, and to take control of my life in ways I'd never thought possible. 6 months after Marcus's sentencing, Elena and I were having coffee at the same cafe where I'd first recorded his confession. As we sat in the corner booth, laughing about something completely unrelated to embezzlement or fraud, I realized how much my life had changed. I'd been promoted at work partly because my experience with the Morrison Associates case had given me insights into business practices that impressed my supervisors. I'd moved to a bigger apartment in a neighborhood I loved. Most importantly, I'd learned to value myself independently of any romantic relationship. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't overheard me complaining about that corporate gala? Elena asked, stirring her latte thoughtfully. I think we would have found each other eventually, I said. Maybe not as dramatically, but I think we were meant to be friends. Elena smiled. Well, whatever brought us together, I'm grateful for it. Even if it involved catching your ex-boyfriend committing federal crimes. As we prepared to leave the cafe, I reflected on everything that had happened since Marcus had told me we could still be friends. He'd meant it as a consolation prize, a way to keep me in his life without giving me any real value or respect. Instead, it had become the catalyst for the most empowering period of my life. I'd learned that friendship based on genuine respect and mutual support was infinitely more valuable than romantic love built on manipulation and convenience. I discovered that I was capable of strategic thinking, decisive action, and courage I'd never known I possessed. Most importantly, I'd realized that the best revenge isn't getting even with someone who's wronged you. The best revenge is building a life so fulfilling that their opinion of you becomes completely irrelevant. Marcus had wanted to be friends because he thought it would keep me safely contained in his orbit, available whenever he needed something but never important enough to threaten his other priorities. Instead, our friendship had led me to Elena, to Richard, to the FBI, and ultimately to the discovery of crimes that sent him to federal prison. As Elena and I walked out of the cafe into the bright Portland sunshine, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. Marcus had been absolutely right about one thing. We definitely could still be friends. He just hadn't anticipated what kind of friend I would turn out to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.